because it was on a Sunday, and most folks who are members of the Sikh community were at their local gurudwaras when they found out. And so it was one of those moments where you are worshiping together, praying together, and you hear about a place of worship not too far from yours that was under attack. And so we were all literally watching the news at our local gurudwara, on the TVs, just watching what was happening. And so again, this past Friday was a 10-year anniversary, and there were, really a week of events leading up in Oak Creek over the past week, really from like Thursday through Sunday, where folks came together from all over the country to heal, to unite, to really talk through and learn from one another and build community. And part of that was also this video that was created by the Sikh Coalition and also the Revolutionary Love Project. Some of you might be familiar with Valerie Kaur. She has a very famous TED Talk now that she had like a few years ago. She has an organization called Revolutionary Love. And so she narrated this really short video that we wanted to share. And then when we come back from the video, we just kind of want to talk through like what emotions come up for you, your thoughts really from your heart in terms of like that video, reflections 10 years later, all of that. So we'll go ahead and watch that quick little video here.
A man entered the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. 6 people were murdered, an incident of domestic terrorism.
A gunman opened fire in a Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin on a Sunday morning in 2012. It was the deadliest massacre of Sikhs on U.S. soil ever. Too many Americans don't remember Oak Creek, but we do.
Not a day goes by when I don't think about that day.
We remember the blood in the prayer hall, the bullet holes in the Lunger Hall, the spot where their mother bled to death, the wails of these children when they found their papa's body.
The moment they told me, I realized I'll never see her again.
You know what else we remember? Our elders rolled up their sleeves, sang our ancestors' prayers, and cleaned the Gurdwara with their own hands. We saw our elders rise. So we rose too. We organized vigils. We testified before Congress.
I want to tell the gunman who took her away from me, you may have been full of hate, but my mother was full of love. She was an American.
We made music and art and song. We fought to change federal policy. And we won. They haven't stopped killing us. Too many communities are targets for the white nationalist violence that keeps breaking our bones, stealing our breath. But we aren't victims. We are survivors. We are warriors and healers, teachers and poets, singers and visionaries. And we have something to show America about how to stand in love. The Sikh spirit of Chardi Kala, ever rising joy, even in darkness, ever rising spirits. America, remember with us. Honor the ones we lost. Be brave with your grief. Harness your rage. Stand in love with us. Together, let's rise.
All right, so we'll just take a moment here. I know that was a lot. So, any thoughts, feelings anyone wants to share, anything, that comes up after viewing that video?
Yeah, I'll start. My name is Lisa Stein. I'm a statewide coach. And I guess what strikes me, and I know I've read Valerie Carr's work before, is just the forgiveness, just the insistence that the community is full of love and that is a way to overcome this horrible hate. It's just always so striking to me, the difference between for that. So I thank you for that little video.
I've seen the video twice now, and what struck me the second time was this idea that it feels like the Sikh community is trying to change the narrative, really kind of frame this in ways that are supportive for them, that actually are helping them both process this, but also not be kind of I don't have the right word for this, but basically not be sitting in it constantly, but also still give it the worth and devotion it deserves. So I found that really interesting, how they're, you know, pushing to really have us think about this in a way that makes sense for them.
Well, one thing that stood out for me, and again, this is like the second time at least that I watched it, but I just paid attention to the fact that, you know, whenever there's a push for a certain kind of legislation that affects one community, as in this case, it also positively has an impact on other communities. So when we talk about hate crimes and there's a legislation to stop that, you know, those help everyone else. So not just the Sikh community here, but everyone. So I'm glad that, you know, that something was able to be done. And hopefully, you know, we will continue to give hope for other, for, you know, for the Sikh community, but also for other groups to see that there's power in unity and there's power in pushing for the right kind of legislation that essentially helps everyone else.
Armin, there's a comment in here, but it also, I want to kind of circle back too about this legislation piece. And I'm trying to, one of the comments was, I hope to learn more about the Sikh role in changing hate crime legislation. And so there was that comment. And then this other comment, I am impressed and overwhelmed with the love as well as the forgiveness, that strength to move forward, harnessing or not allowing hate, anger, retaliation. And that was one of the things that stood out to me. Was about 3 years ago, Dr. Dhaliwal and Jim Santel. And there was another doctor who came with, there was three gentlemen.
Dr. Gadawal.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
And so it was one of these things, you know, when you're at work, you just never know what happens going to come up. So somebody said, you're meeting with these folks today. I knew nothing of what was going to show up. So I just said, okay. So I'm at this meeting, and that comment and seeing that there about the legislation and the testifying and how now the FBI tracks that hate crime, that was an action because of what happened in Wisconsin. And then how many years later it came to my office door, right? So they came with these FBI statistics about the hate crime that is happening, and the numbers, the steep increase. And I don't remember all of the numbers to it, but it was really profound. And it was in this moment that I'm like, here are these children learning in our schools, and I'm the director of teaching and learning, and I am not addressing this at all. It's not on my radar at all. So had that testimony not happen, had the FBI not start collecting that data, had people not start knocking on my door, setting up a meeting with me, and this whole thing. And now here we are in this community. So I don't know if you can speak more to that, any of it.
Yeah, I mean, so the young man that testified before Congress in 2012, his name is Harpreet Singh Serni. His mom was one of the victims of the shooting, and he was 18 years old at the time, and he's 28 now. And I actually had the honor of meeting him earlier this year and getting lunch with him when I was in Wisconsin, and just kind of talking to him about like the reflection 10 years later. And it's like visibly striking because you see him go from like a young 18-year-old to he's a grown man, he's married. He's changed in so many ways in those 10 years. And even still, at the time, 10 years ago, he went before Congress and said, my mother deserves the dignity of being a statistic, because at the time there was no tracking of Sikh hate crimes. It was just lumped in as just general violence, and the FBI was not tracking anti-Sikh hate. And so that is now being tracked. And even still now, 10 years later, we had a congressional briefing a few weeks ago, and he was again there advocating for more changes in terms of like tracking domestic terrorism, a Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, the Justice for Hate Crimes Victims Act, more funding for places of worship to have security. And on that panel was also the pastor from Mother Emanuel Church. There was the rabbi from Pittsburgh, whose synagogue was attacked. And so it was folks from different faith communities who have seen the violence and the hate against their communities, again, joining together for these policy asks, because for as much as that changed between 10 years ago to today, there's still a lot more that folks want to see happen. And the biggest thing that I've learned from Harpreet and from other folks who lost their loved ones is they just want their family members and their loved ones to not be forgotten as just a part of history, but like these were the most important people in their lives, right? Like there's nothing that anyone can do 10 years later that changes the fact that his mother is gone. And he talked about like, I got married and my mom wasn't there, and how much that impacted him. And like through his whole entire wedding, all he kept thinking about was his mom 10 years ago and not being able to have her there. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but just to say that like it's there's a lot that the community saw change from 10 years ago to today, but there's a lot more that folks are still advocating for moving forward.
And Margot has a comment in here. I think it's Margot. It just gives me little initials, so I can't always see who wrote it. But I was drawn to the young voice speaking of how their elders modeled behaviors, and that the young recognized and used to take their actions, respect, role modeling the values of their life.
One of the things that we often talk about is like before Oak Creek, there was September 11th. Before that, members of the Sikh community during the Iran hostage crisis were called Ayatollah and were attacked then. Before that, in 1907, there were the Bellingham riots in Washington. So it is always like looking back in terms of like what did folks before you experience and go through. And I think for a lot of folks in our community, it's like getting the strength from like, whatever challenges I had, like when my dad moved to Detroit in the early 1980s, he was one of maybe 3 Sikhs in the state of Michigan at that point. There was just 3 of them, and they would just like, they literally couldn't even get like Indian food because there was no store that sold it. So they would have to go to Windsor in Canada to get food there and bring it back, because that was the only place they could go. There was no community that they could kind of go through. And so it is always like looking to like the older generations, I think, within not just the Sikh community, but I think a lot of communities that have experienced hate or violence is like looking to the strength of the people that came before you and what they not only went through, but also what they created so that the future generations wouldn't experience that as well.
And I hate to say this, but that many of us, if we are looking to our elders, lived with racist people. And so if that modeling is negative, that's what we hear and see, and that's what we learn. So not only are we going to have to work with our students and ourselves, but it's our parents and the other adults, so we can stop some of the bad role modeling.
Yeah, I think that was, you know, a really powerful, you know, point to think about how are we modeling and how are we, what are the conversations that we're having? Often, you know, you know, just in the last maybe, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, you know, there was, I can't remember, it was some company that did the talk for, you know, the talk that African Americans have to have with their children. And, you know, I think other communities don't have to have that. So they just kind of don't talk about it. So I can only imagine what the Sikh community has to talk to their children about, you know, as they just authentically are moving about life as themselves. So, you know, this weekend I took some time to talk to my children about this, which I had never done. And I thought it was really, really weird because we have so many conversations, you know, about different things in our community. But I was like, wow, I never even had this conversation about something that happened in Wisconsin with my children who were not alive at the time when this happened, but wanted to, but you know, you just kind of, again, it's the way, so how we so easily, I don't want to say forget, I think it's willfully forget, because it's a, you know, because it can be traumatizing. It is hard. It is hard to process and to think what kind of would bring about something like this. And then also it's hard to process, especially for people of color, to think that we know that this is still a very real part of our lives, you know. And I shouldn't just say we're seeing just more, we have the gun violence conversation later, but that's, you know, we're all seeing this, like, this craziness in our world. And you know, just really taking the time to model to our children that we can have these conversations and we can talk about how you're feeling and we can talk about what you're processing when we see things. And for us, I don't know how many people have children on this call, but media, man, it is out of control. It's coming at these kids 24/7. You don't know what your children are watching or what is influencing them. So if you really don't take the time to sit and have conversations with them about what they're seeing, how they're feeling about it, what they're processing, it can get out of control. And then, you know, these things happen. So you know, so I don't know, I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it was just very, for me to see this and to, you know, have this, and to start thinking about this, you know, and how I would wanted to work with, you know, the children in my life first, and then thinking about how do I now start to think about that in my work, was extremely powerful.
Thank you, Bianca. I want my sister Liz, who's on the call, and Mark and I were able to go to the vigil on the 5th. I know Harmon was watching that live stream too, so he was there as well. I took a few images, so I'm going to share my screen, but if there are other folks who came to that, who were there at any of the events this past week, I'm just opening up an invitation for sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and share this and hand this off to my colleagues, Mark and to Harmon.
Thanks, Tamara. So I want to share a few thoughts about just some of what I saw and experienced on Friday night, but I actually want to start with Harmon and put it in this bigger container, which is there were multiple events over Thursday through Sunday related to what happened 10 years ago. And I think it's important to kind of think about the vigil, was what I went to along with Tamara and Liz, and but there was much more than that. And Harmon, if you're willing, could you just kind of talk us through a little bit about what was the overall goal? How was this kind of put together? That kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I know a few folks touched on is response to tragedy. And I think within the Oak Creek Sikh community, the Wisconsin Sikh community, and this is a national community at large, there were a lot of differing opinions in terms of like, how do you honor 10 years later and how do you recognize? And there were certainly some folks in the community, both in Oak Creek and outside of Oak Creek, that were like, hey, it's been 10 years, maybe it's time for us to find other ways instead of, having a larger event, just kind of move forward as a community. And there were others, particularly the family members that were centered in this, who wanted their family members who were lost. For the dignity of recognizing that 10 years later, they did want events in Oak Creek around that. And so there was a lot that went on between us with the Sikh Coalition, SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense Education Fund, Pradeep Galika, who also lost his father. His father was the Gurdwara president at the time. He started an interfaith organization in the greater Milwaukee area. And then the Oak Creek Gurdwara itself. All of us kind of came together and mapped out what are the ways in which we can remember what happened, heal around what happened, build more community, and then what can we do after these events are over to continue that engagement. And so within the healing part, I would say the biggest thing, the most important thing, the thing that maybe a lot of people didn't see necessarily, was there were continuous prayers going on, singing of hymns. There's about 48 hours of continuous just singing of the hymns that were going on at the Oak Creek Gurdwara that culminated on Sunday. Beyond that, there were a lot of advocacy asked. So like the things that I talked about earlier, of like domestic terrorism prevention, hate crime legislation, specific asks around security grants for places of worship. There were a lot of those asks that were made to elected officials. Over 89 Gurdwaras across the country signed on to a letter to the president asking for specific policy recommendations that the community has. So there's a lot of advocacy that was done behind the scenes that community members were engaged in. And then there was obviously the vigil that took place on Friday night, really where community leaders from different backgrounds, faith traditions, organizations came together to talk about what this meant to them 10 years ago and what it means to them today. All of the families had someone represent their family in terms of talking about their loved one who was lost. And it was primarily the children or grandchildren of the ones who were lost that went up there and spoke, which was very emotional. And then there were also folks who were impacted by what happened that maybe aren't members of the Sikh community. One of those individuals, James Santel, Tamara, you brought up, really moving speech that he gave. He was at the time a district prosecutor who worked with the Sikh community. And he talked about how prior to this tragedy, he had no relationship with the Sikh community. He had driven by the Gurdwara, but didn't really know the folks who were there. And 10 years later, he is so connected with the community in an unbelievable way. When I went to Oak Creek to the public library event earlier this year, he literally took me to the Gurdwara. He walked in and all of the people there were like, hey, Jim, how's it going? Everyone kind of knows him. He goes to the Gurdwara like once a month. 10 years later, every month, he goes at least once a month to connect with the community members. And he spoke about how the event made him a better person and had him learn about the people around him and how much that impacted him. And to me, that was one of the most beautiful things, because that is exactly what the family members wanted when we had these conversations with them, is we want our community to learn, to grow, and to just love each other more. And I think he kind of exemplified like what that looked like in practice, because it's not easy, right? It's easy to be like, I'll go to an event this weekend and then I'm done. Like for 10 years, he has been so entrenched in the community to where everyone in Wisconsin who's a member of the Sikh community knows him by name. He doesn't understand the language. There's often a language barrier, but like they communicate enough between just him visibly showing up every time that folks know, love, and trust him because he just shows up. Even if he doesn't have the language of how do I communicate with someone who is maybe much older, who doesn't understand English, they still understand Jim is here because he cares about our community. And I think that's like the biggest thing that I took away from this, is the people that just keep showing up and keep showing that support and love.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Harmon. And I think a lot of what you said really resonates with me too, in terms of some of the things I was taking away from this. So just if you see, Tamara, can you show the picture again for a second, please? Thank you. So you'll notice up on the top, Heal, Unite, Act. That was one of kind of like the overarching theme of what was happening here. And I'm actually going to let Tamara talk about that in a little bit. But when we showed up, we even got little wristbands, and it says Heal, Unite, Act. It has the date, and I'm assuming Heal, Unite, Act in the Sikh language. So it was really interesting to kind of have that as a framing device. So when we arrived, there was a big tent set up near the Gurdwara, and the tent was full, and that was excellent. And people kept coming and kept coming, and they nearly ran out of parking. Everyone who was there was asked to cover our heads, and in fact, we had help doing that so that it was done correctly, as far as I can tell. So there were some young people who were helping to do that with all of us and put on our headscarves, which was really, I thought, a neat touch, and also really important for many reasons. Like Carmen said, there were all sorts of people there. We had politicians. We had Tony Evers, Josh Kaul was there, representatives from the Biden administration were there, and other religious officials were there to support the Sikhi. But ultimately, the Sikhi people were centered. And to me, the most powerful part was when the family members of each of the 7 individuals who had died as a result of that shooting spoke. And they shared a lot of things. And at least 2 of them called out stricter gun laws as something that they wanted to put out. One told the story about how the event in 2012 actually led to him eventually becoming a police officer. And what also struck me was that their speeches weren't necessarily formal or polished, for lack of a better word, but I really saw that as a good thing, because in my mind, they were and are still dealing with their grief. And so they were being really authentic, and that's important since they were having to speak in public about this really tragic day in their lives. And I thought they did such a beautiful job. One young woman talked about how people had reached out to her that day about the anniversary of the shooting. And she said, while she certainly appreciated it, she wanted everyone to know that the pain remains every day, not just on the days of this anniversary, since she still misses her father every single day. The vigil also paid homage to one of the police officers that nearly died that day. And as Harmon just talked about, there was a U.S. attorney, Jim Santel, who had been such a big support. So they talked about him as well. On the screen, earlier when we had the picture, it was a ceremony with the candles, which was really moving, where we were taking these candles that we had been given while we were in the tent, and they were lit by some of the family members who were involved in this. And then we all took those in front of the Gurdwara and put them there. And that's the picture that you see. And it was just really beautiful in so many ways. And I just want to share one more thing too, and then I want to open this up to anybody else who was there who wants to talk about it. But one of the things that happened is when we were in the tent and we had all these different speakers who were talking to us, and the tent was near the Gurdwara, but as we were looking at the stage, behind the stage, we could simultaneously see a number of young Sikh children and others playing on the swings and other playground equipment nearby. And for me, that was such an interesting juxtaposition between what was often a more somber ceremony, although not always, and then you had the energy of these kids. And this work, in my opinion, is really for them, not just the work we're doing as part of this group, but the work that they did during that weekend was really for them. And even if they didn't understand what was necessarily always going on, I felt like it was a really powerful testament that kind of life goes on, but we can hold both of those things at the same time. So those were some of my thoughts. And Liz, Tamara, anyone else who was there, feel free to jump in.
Or anybody who wants to build or to make a connection or ask a question.
I'll jump in. Where you just left off, Mark, about the kids, the life goes on part, and the event going on in the tent. I noticed that as well. And the event was really, it wasn't, you know, the part we were at, the vigil part, life was going on, even as these lives were remembered. And I think that links back to Harmon, what you were saying about, you know, people not marinating in their trauma, but it's time to move on and coming to a balance about how do we honor the memory while also bring our community forward, I think is what I saw. And that's in the action part of the Heal, Unite Act. And so that action was made a part of the remembrance there, and what you were talking about with the hate crime legislation. And the people said, the woman said in the video, the kids following the mentors who were the parents and stuff, they action, maybe not even words, but seeing the action and as the model, and then acting in the world, acting out, you know, that is what I really saw, people living in the world and acting out, you know, the values of, there was the love, but also then the service. I think it might go back to that core value of Sikhi and service and justice. It made me think of ties back to those core values in terms of advocating for the crime statistics, the hate crime legislation, and what can be done in the community. So yeah. And one thing I will say, it's such a beautiful piece of property there. Afterwards, I went for a little walk by myself, and I was walking away from the Guadara and then back, and just imagining just how difficult it is to imagine that event happening in that beautiful space. I think it was on a Sunday morning in the bright sunshine. The juxtaposition is you know, it's a struggle to understand that, but so important to understand that that happens. And as you pointed out, happens again and again and again, and not just with in the Sikh community, but the Jewish community, the Black community. And sadly, you know, that's a point where a lot of diverse folks are now converging around this hate crime legislation and what repairs can be made.
Emma, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share at the moment?
The one thing that I would say about it is just this idea of heal, unite, and act. And I didn't put a picture up there. Maybe I'll put it in my email that I send out to you. Is this, they had a big banner in the backdrop, and it had those 3 words. And I was thinking about how that just, those 3 words just really resonated within me around the need to heal. Sometimes we act before we heal, but also, so there, I saw it as a sequence, but I also saw how acting can also be part of the healing process. And so just this idea of those 3 words just really landing on me, and then reflecting back on this group too. So it's been powerful for me to think about, we came up with this tagline of like what we are, like what is our mission for this Love and Action work group. And it's really around leaning into our shared history to work towards healing and our collective liberation. And many of you, I look at Brother Payne, I look at Margot, I look at, I know Lisa and Katie. I mean, like you have, I can't even count on both hands, like how many events you've come to. And it's just that same piece about there's so much for us to learn and how our interdependence is right there. Like this is our shared history. This is an event that happened with us, and like how we come together for that collective healing and not to heal alone, but to heal in community, right? And just how we can take action. So those three very simple words, heal, unite, act, are just reverberate through my soul.
Real quick on that too, is one of the young men who lost his father, he said it took him 10 years to write the speech he was giving that day. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of just kind of encapsulating how many emotions, feelings, moments of his life he had to go through for the 10 years later to be able to speak about it. And at the end, he was clearly emotional, just saying, I can't believe there's so many people here in this moment. And I think that touched me in a really deep way, because it is about like the healing. Like it's 10 years later, he's still healing, right? Like there's still healing that takes place 10 years later. And part of that healing again was like the action of speaking there and seeing how many people were there just out of love for their community, even though they may be of quote unquote different communities. Like that is still a community of folks that were there, sharing in that pain and in that tragedy and in the growth that happens in it. So yeah, I think that all resonates a lot with me in terms of what everyone was talking about.
I just want to add real quickly two things, what Alfonso said and what Edward Mao has just said. Alfonso said, James Baldwin used to say, white people know one thing for sure, they know they don't want to be Black here. And then Edward said, I think by getting to know each other better, we will better relate to each other's lives, including these tragedies. And this reminds me of the earlier workshop Tamara and I were in today at this conference, where we was talking about building partnerships and talking about white supremacy. And I had made the comment that white supremacy and white supremacists don't want us to get to know each other better. And that's what we have to keep fighting. We have to keep penetrating that message. While they send in the message, we want to make America great again and take it back. We have to keep putting forth the message that by us getting to know one another, and because we share in our tragedies, and sometimes those tragedies are even personal in nature, where we cling to family to help us get through that. We, on a personal level, but on a collective level, we get through it by what Edward is saying, by getting to know each other better. And the more time we spend getting to know each other better, that is the weapon that can defeat the hate that's being brought forward.
Well, Kevin, we started our day with love, and I think we're closing out our work day with love too. So that's, yeah. So yeah, it's just showing up. The one thing, and this might be a transition for us to move from this to our article that we read for our homework, is another thing that stood out, and I took a picture of it. I'll put it, I couldn't put all the pictures in here. I didn't know for sure if folks would want to see all these pictures or not, but if you know me, you know I got a camera not too far from me. So, and I'm taking pictures and just to kind of hold this. And so one of it was this huge fire truck with a huge ladder and this enormous flag, the United States flag. And thinking about the comment that was made when the young man was testifying, and he said that my mother operated in love. She was an American. And so like this idea of how did the Sikh come here from Punjab? How how that whole immigration piece and whatnot. But I was just reminded of that in thinking about what our reading assignment was, but also thinking about that huge US flag that was there as well too. So I don't know, just was resonating with me.
Any other comments before we move forward? And just recalling this idea that we talked about in session 1, which is these conversations are going to feel unfinished, because I can guarantee a bunch of us could probably talk for the rest of the night just on what happened on Friday night. So knowing that, I do want to make sure that we give anybody else a chance to jump in. Otherwise, we'll move forward to our next piece. All right, so we're going to be looking at something here in just a second. And I believe, Harmon, you're gonna kind of set this up, and we're planning to then go into some breakout groups, folks.
Yeah, so in terms of the reading, there were a couple points of clarification I just kind of wanted to start with, again, just for shared language and shared group understanding. The first thing I wanted to clarify, and I apologize, maybe I should have put this in the pre-reading just as a point of reference for folks. The term Punjabi, I know that may be a term that we didn't necessarily discuss too much, other than to say Sikhism originated in the Punjab region of South Asia. So one thing I wanted to clarify is, not all Sikhs are Punjabi, and not all Punjabis are Sikh, right? So we have two different concepts here. Punjab is a region. There are people there who are Hindu, Muslim, Christian, atheist, all sorts of religions, Sikh. And then there are also Sikhs who are of all different backgrounds, who are Black, white, African, Spanish. There's all different races of people who practice the Sikh faith. But by and large, most folks who practice the Sikh faith are also Punjabi. And so this article that was sent out is largely about the Punjabi Sikh Mexican American community, right? Because most of the Punjabis that migrated at that time were members of the Sikh faith. So that's the first thing I wanted to clarify in case there was any confusion in terms of, well, they're talking about this Punjabi culture, but you're talking about Sikhism, what's going on there? It's just that most Sikhs are Punjabi, and so that's the reason that article is relevant. The second thing I wanted to clarify in the second question you'll see here, which is how does the construct of race impact community dynamics such as miscegenation laws, which permitted Punjabi and Hispanic couples, both quote unquote brown, to marry. Just shared language around miscegenation. So basically miscegenation laws were laws that enforce racial segregation at the marriage level by criminalizing interracial marriage. And so the laws, in North America, like from the 17th century onwards, restricted folks of different ethnic backgrounds from marrying one another. So to marry someone, you had to be of the same race. So that's just shared language around the word miscegenation. So I think what we're going to do in these breakout sessions is folks can pick either question that they want to talk about. And I think we're going to give 10 minutes here. So whatever question speaks to you, if you can knock out both questions, more power to you. But whatever question your group wants to kind of stick to or talk about, feel free to talk it out. And I think we'll also drop these questions in the chat so folks have it as a reference point. Awesome.
All right, that sounds good. I'm going to create some breakout rooms with 3 participants. So you want to room ship it off to you?
All right. So I know we had a couple questions that were posed, but I just kind of want to hear folks, the conversations that were had. It doesn't necessarily have to stick to those questions in particular. If there was like a rich conversation around something else with the pre-reading, I just love to hear what folks were talking about in their groups.
Our group talked mostly about the ability to date outside your race. And I recently saw the movie Loving, and I did some work at the college about that, and reminding people it wasn't really that long ago in general. It was 1967 or 69 where blacks and whites could legally marry. That's not that long ago. And for something just as simple as skin color. So to see it even just worded, well, they were both brown, so we'll just let it go, and disregarding them as people who have lots of identities and, and the values of each person. It's so disheartening that it's taking so long for some of these things. And then I just shared, there's a movie on Amazon Prime right now that's based on a true story, that it was the early 70s and they were still segregating proms. So yeah, we had, the desegregation of schools, but yet prom, you can't be dancing with someone, who's Black if you're white, and et cetera. And so that's why this is just so important, because we can't, in order to not repeat history, right, we have to remember what it really was or is.
Yeah, our group also talked about loving, and that was kind of the first point of conversation that we had as well, and the connection point there, and also just the idea, like you said, of like brown as being a race, right? Like, what does that mean? These are folks from different backgrounds, cultures, communities, but because visually they may have looked similar in some ways, you're just categorized into like, you are now a brown. And the folks that are a part of this, like, they don't like, there's no brown category in Punjab, right? Like, but all of a sudden you come to a new place and now you're categorized into a box that you didn't even know you were a part of, that you didn't know existed in this new place you're in. Any other conversations folks are having that they want to share up?
I just want to add one clarification in case people weren't aware. When we're talking about Loving, it's the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case back in 1967. So your first instinct was right, Leslie, but back in 1967. And it was essentially a huge civil rights case that was essentially saying banning interracial marriage is violating the Equal Protection and Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So if you're following the latest news, there's been some conversation about this case again lately too, in relation to the Roe v. Wade case. And I don't want to go there, but just you might hear some connections to the 14th Amendment again, and how that case is apparently safe, but others maybe less so. So I just wanted to make sure people were up to speed on Loving versus Virginia if you weren't familiar with it. And Leslie brought up, there is a movie about it that is interesting. I can't remember where it's at. Maybe Netflix. I don't know.
We talked in our group how wonderful it would be if all of the prejudiced people, the white supremacists, just died off, and you hope that as they're dying off, the kids will not be subjected to that particular teaching. Wishful, hopeful thinking. But at the same time, again, when we was in our session this morning, earlier this afternoon, it was a section where a young white kid went up to a young Black girl and said, "Ooh, you coming into the movie? Come on in with me." But that was during a time where it says colors only, whites only. But he as a young kid, he hadn't been indoctrinated by his parents. He was allowed to think freely, but at the same time that he was thinking freely, he didn't realize that there are signs. And so on one hand, we're allowing our children to grow up and just be themselves, just like that one commercial where it shows the one white kid and the little Black kids run up down and then they just hug one another. And it's like, that's what we're talking about. But yet we know we got that faction out there that's saying, we don't want to see that. And again, that's why we have to be diligent, and keep our guards up. And it's like we have to stay in tune and insightful. And by keep doing what we're doing, this keeps us grounded. So when we see it, we can, what's the three things, Tamara?
Heal, unite, act.
Unite and act. When we see it, we can act.
Mm-hmm.
And this is our action.
in our group, we talked a lot about me being a numbers geek. I would love to go back and look at the census categorization from the time the census started till now, and how all of the labels have changed and how they will have to change in the near future. Even just the survey that was done with this group. When I first started this group, there were like male, female, choose not to say anything. And then now, like, there's 8. I didn't count them, but I almost took a copy, printed off a copy of that to show it to our district because all of that. And yeah, so I'd like to see the progression of the census categories. As a 5th grade teacher in Manitowoc, I told Liz that we had to use the word Asian. In Manitowoc, it wasn't necessarily real specific color, but it was culture. Were you Hmong? Were you Philippine? Were you Chinese? Were you Japanese? We had them all, and they were very particular that we used, the adults were particular that we used the word Asian so that we didn't pinpoint the different cultures because we could have been wrong.
You know, that categorization part is really interesting. And it was in the article as well, where they talked about how a lot of folks were categorized as Hindu Mexican, even though they were largely Sikh, right? But because the folks doing the categorization didn't know and or didn't care what the categories were, because they were coming from India, they were just categorized as Hindu. And so like that's also like an interesting part of so much of this history is when you look at like the documentation from like the early 1900s in this country, a lot of the Sikh stories were categorized as Hindu. So like there were riots in 1907 in Bellingham, Washington, and it was called anti-Hindu riots. But the folks that were the victims of the riots were Sikh. But again, because they were migrating from India, little to no effort was put into like actually understanding who these people were. And so everyone from India was just categorized as Hindu. So that's like one of those interesting nuances of like, well, who is defining what a community is and how they choose to identify. And it also like, I'd love to get people's thoughts if they had any conversation around this of like, what is like, how does it to be defined American, right? Because we talked about in the conversation around Oak Creek, Harpreet saying, you know, my mother was an American, right? And then asserting that because the person who killed his mother didn't recognize her clearly as an American, right? He recognized her as an outsider to the country. And like even in looking at like the Sikh immigration story, there was a really important civil rights Supreme Court case here in the United States. So Bhagat Singh Thind, he was a member of the U.S. Army in 1918. And his citizenship was rescinded in 1923 because of his non-Caucasian status. And so he fought a Supreme Court case basically saying, I enlisted in the US Army, I fought for the United States, and I'm still being denied citizenship because I am not classified as Caucasian. And so he challenged that case on the basis of saying, I am a Caucasian. Even though he knew he wasn't, he was challenging, well, what does it mean to be Caucasian? And so, you know, there's so many of these stories like throughout history of like, what does it mean to be an American? If you fight for your country in a world war, if that still doesn't make you an American, then what does, right? Then at that point, you're saying only race is the categorization. So I'd just love to hear if anyone had any thoughts on like, what does it mean to be American and that conversation around any of that.
Harmon, that one hits close to home. So I provide pastoral care to detained immigrants here in Wisconsin. So we incarcerate 500. The federal government, ICE, buys beds from Wisconsin jails. And so we incarcerate 500 undocumented citizens in Wisconsin. And so I'm part of an organization. And so we one of 5 in the nation that is allowed to be face-to-face and provide pastoral care to folks who are being detained. And I just remember, and I think it was in the last couple of years, I think it got some national attention, was when one of the Marines who was technically not a US citizen, so was Mexican, but was a Marine, and he came back from Afghanistan, and he got picked up in an ICE sweep, and so was deported back to Mexico. So it is one of the questions about what does it mean to be an American? So fighting for your country, giving your life for your country, but still not allowed citizenship because of color of skin. So. And so we see this as, you said 1918, but it's a contemporary issue too, even under the Biden administration.
Well, and I would just add to that too, Tamara, is that, you talked about when we were at the vigil the other night of that big American flag that was hanging up there. And I said to you, I said, I understand maybe why that's there, but it also kind of seems offensive that they have to prove, in fact, that they are, in fact, American, and that we have to continually remind people of that. And so I have a very tortured relationship with the American flag, but that's a different story. But anyway, I think this question, Harman, about what is an American or who is an American is so powerful and easily could be an hour and a half minimum on just that.
That was my suggestion, to do it as homework, because it's way big. That's intense thinking.
We kind of talked on that. This is Katie. In our group, was with Kevin and Alfonso. I talked about it a little bit in reference to like who's accepted, and like in reference to the article about the restaurant and the food they served and how people wanted to change that or order something different that wasn't on the menu, sometimes to mash it up, but like who's deciding who's acceptable? And a lot of times we use that surface stuff like food or clothing or dancing or music to try to find a way to make someone acceptable, right? And I'm talking about white people, and so it's really disingenuous, I think, and like Kevin, I think, what we were just saying all together, like who decides who's acceptable in a community and who isn't, and just knowing that happens in everyday life, and that is some action. I think a place that we could take action, I think, is really getting to know what is it about the food at this ethnic place, what doesn't constitute ethnic food, like what's important to people about the food they eat. It's more than the food, right? It means something to people. And we've talked about that in other groups. And so I think in the right here and now, that type of small action can lead to some pretty big impactful steps when you're having conversations with people who are ignorant or just plain don't understand, Yeah,
and I'm wondering,
and
I'm wondering, once I was in Mississippi and I met an Asian American, and she had the Southern accent down to a T. If I closed my eyes and listened to her, I would not be able to tell she was Asian American. But once I open my eyes, I'm looking dead at her, I'm going, she's not speaking in broken English. She's speaking in a Southern dialect that's originated from the South, and that's that dialect. It's just like a Boston accent or a New York accent, and it's like, now, I know she has to be considered an American citizen. Or is she? And by whose standards?
I think that's such an interesting point, because I do work with the intercultural development inventory assessment. And one of the questions people get to work on their intercultural competence is to investigate and study what your own culture is. And every single person, being that I work at a PWI, predominantly white institution, they like my American culture. And I'm like, well, sure, if that's what you want. But people don't know. And it's what makes this question so amazing, and I think has a lot of us thinking, is that depending where you're raised in this country, your upbringing is different. And we seem to accept that, but we don't accept, because if this woman in your situation says she was born here, but what would people say to her a lot of times? But where are you really from? Right? That's what people of color and minorities get. And no, she was born here. She's an American citizen. So even citizenship doesn't always get you the right to say that you're a citizen. So I just wrote it down. I'm like, I have to take this to work and do something with this. Sorry, my neighbor's working on his car. This is great. Thank you, Harmon, for bringing this question, because I don't think a lot of us think about it. I don't choose to be called African American. I just don't, because I don't want American at the end of it. I was born in this country. I've left to travel, and that's it. And I feel like, for me personally, I'm always justifying that I can be here if I say it. Some people don't feel that way, and that's fine. That's just me. So the wheels are just really spinning. I appreciate this whole conversation.
Thank you, Leslie. I can really respect that. And I'm gonna say this too. When in 1981, and I know he don't mind me saying this, Dr. Howard Fuller was, he wasn't doctor then, it was just Howard Fuller. He had helped Tony Earl out in his campaign, and Tony Earl made him Secretary of Employment Relations. And so he was calling from Milwaukee, trying to find places to live in Madison, because he had to move to Madison. And the lady told him, I do not rent to I don't rent to Black people. And he said, okay, fine. And then shows up at the door, said, I'm here to rent the apartment. She couldn't tell that when she was talking to him that she was talking to a Black man, because the person spoke standard English. And because you speak in standard English, they can't tell the difference. So they feel at liberty to say what they feel they can say, because they don't physically, they're not using their eyes to see you. They're just using their ears. But then, like you say, all of a sudden, when they see you, all of a sudden, now they want to put this barrier on you, because they now see you. And you putting this barrier on people because of the way you were brought up and the way you were indoctrinated. And you were indoctrinated by our governmental institutions, federal, state, local, and our educational institutions. And because the institutions did this, as an individual, you feel it's okay, or as an individual, you feel you're trapped, because it's the institution that's not allowing you to break. And we are the ones who have to break the institution, because institutions are made of people.
So we're going to be able to pick this conversation up when we come back next week. There were 2 videos that we wanted to show that continues to lean into this idea of the civil rights movement, right? So the 1960 civil rights movement. So we'll be able to continue this conversation. I'm a little remiss of 2 things. One, that we didn't put that slide up around the 4 agreements, but because this is the time that I just want to call that in to, one of the agreements is to expect and accept non-closure, right? And this is not a conversation that's going to feel tidy right now. And things are probably coming up for folks, and it doesn't feel like we can put a bow on it. And we don't need to put a bow on it, right? So expecting and accepting non-closure. And Leslie, it sounds like you're going to be processing at work with your colleagues. I know we'll come back to it and process it with our colleagues. And got my dad here, my sister. I want to talk to my dad back, about, anyway, there's so many things that are coming up for me. So I think this would be a good time to pause. Just checking with my facilitants too, Harmon. And okay, I got the thumbs up. So, all right.
And
so
Tamara, what time we having dinner with your dad and sister?
Dad's got to get to town. He's got to get back to Wisconsin. He's over on the East Coast right now. He's in Maine. So we got to get him back to Wisconsin. As soon as he's here, we'll do a family dinner. So absolutely. So just
As long as he pays.
Oh, Alfonso, that is his dream. He loves pain. So we usually, now that we're grown-ups, we always say, we'll get this one, Dad. But he feels like that's his role still, even though we're grown. So that's Dad. So Dad will probably pay. He'll get up and he'll go pay before the bill even comes to the table. So yes, he's got it. So just being with what is right now, we heard some action that's coming up about just continuing conversation. This is the year that we've been talking about this idea of these freedom dreams. I love this space that allows us to just really grapple with concepts, go deeper and deeper and deeper, thinking about putting that into freedom dreaming, and then also thinking about how do we move that to action. So continue to chew on that. I'm going to put the slide up, and as I put the slide up, Mark, if you don't mind putting the links in for the exit. You already, Mark, thank you for knowing me as well as you do there. Exit slip.
Occasionally we're a well-oiled machine, Tamara. Occasionally.
Well, this is it. So we would like you to complete that exit slip if you can click on that. Otherwise, I am going to do better about sending out the follow-up email tomorrow. So you'll have that. There is an article for pre-reading. Harmon, we didn't talk about this at all, but is there anything that you want to do to set up that article? Or you can tell me too in writing if you want. Otherwise, I'll just drop it into that email.
Yeah, I can put it in the email. Yep, we can do that.
All right, sounds good. So we'll continue to look at that. We're going to be moving into next week. I think we're going to take a look at, we'll continue a little bit about the farming, and I think, is that what we're leaning into next? Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
All right, so this conversation we'll be able to continue that. So continue to think about from your own identity, from your own perspective, where your own orientation is, just how this information is landing on you, and thinking about what action, what's stirring inside of you to take action. So, and again, it doesn't have to be, it's even thinking about how we started today with heal, unite, act. This might not be a time for acting, but it might be a time for uniting and learning and doing that, but thinking about that concept of heal, unite, act. So otherwise, it is 7:31. I want to just end with gratitude. So thank you to each one of you. Thank you, Harmon, for selecting these readings for us, for posing such thoughtful questions, and for everybody for just being part of this. This is the collective wisdom of the group, and really leaning into our shared learning to work towards healing and our collective liberation. So thank you. Have a good night, and we'll see you all next week.